Hey guys, so in a previous video I talked about what I thought were the best white items in Risk of Rain 2. That video did pretty well, so I thought why not capitalize on that success and talk about some more of these items. Besides, talking about good items is fun and all, but it's way more fun to trash on some items we can all probably agree kinda suck. With that said, let's talk about what I think are the 10 worst white items in Risk of Rain 2. Let's get into it. Number 10, Topaz Brooch. Gain a temporary barrier on kill for 15 health. Okay, probably not the best item to start with on a list of the worst items, because this item is actually pretty okay most of the time, but we had to start somewhere. Topaz Brooch has 3 main issues that I see, the first being that 1 stack just doesn't do a whole lot. The barrier granted is a flat 15 health and doesn't scale. That's not terrible for early game, but once you get into mid to late game where you have upwards of 500 health and enemies deal much more damage, 1 or 2 stacks of Topaz just won't cut it. This actually leads into my second problem with Topaz Brooch. Some of you might be thinking that Topaz actually works pretty well with more than 2 or 3 stacks, and you wouldn't be wrong. The problem here is that 4 or 5 stacks of Topaz, which I think is the point where it actually becomes pretty good, is a lot of item real estate to be spending on barrier, which decays really quickly if you aren't actively killing enemies. Lastly, Topaz Brooch is activated on kill, which means that it doesn't help you if you aren't actively killing enemies. And it does little to nothing on the moon against Mithrix if you aren't rocking a Forgive Me Please. With all that said, I don't think Topaz Brooch is a bad item at all. It's just pretty limited in a non-looped run and requires a lot of item real estate to work really well. Number 9, Medkit. 2 seconds after getting hurt, heal for 20 health plus an additional 5% of your maximum health. Just like with Topaz Brooch, we have another item that I don't think is actually bad, it just has a few glaring flaws. The healing you get from Medkit isn't too bad, and Medkit doesn't care what the source of damage was or how much damage was taken. You could take 1 point of damage, and after 2 seconds, Medkit will heal you for 20 health plus 5% of your max HP. Sounds like a good deal, and in that situation, it actually is. However, if you take any damage during this 2-second delay, the timer resets and you lose out on the healing you would have received from the first intake of damage. This makes Medkit ineffective if you are continually taking damage, even if the damage you are taking is minimal. Burns, bleeds, and poisons counter Medkit pretty hard and leave you very vulnerable if Medkit is your only source of healing. The other problem is that Medkit requires you to take damage in order to get any healing. If your Medkit doesn't fully heal you from the damage you took, you have to either rely on other sources of healing for the rest, or take damage again to activate Medkit, which isn't a very good idea most of the time. Theoretically, Medkit heals you exactly when you need it, which is right after taking damage, but it also doesn't really help in keeping you fully healed after you take damage, so it's not always that great. Number 8, Armor Piercing Rounds. Deal an additional 20% damage to bosses. You're probably starting to see a theme here. A lot of the items on this list aren't here because their effects are necessarily bad or useless, but rather because they are highly situational. This item is no exception, as the effect of Armor Piercing Rounds is very straightforward and theoretically helpful, but only in a very specific context. Now, what the game considers a boss is really just any enemy with a big red health bar, such as those spawned by the Teleporter or Mithrix, or the Chimera that Mithrix makes you fight. 20% extra damage against these enemies is definitely appreciated, but from my own personal experience, oftentimes a boss by themselves isn't really what gets you into trouble, with the exception of maybe Mithrix and Z constructs. It's usually the horde of little gremlins that want nothing more than to chip away at your health until you want to scream that ends up getting you killed, rather than the big badass boss. Now, killing the big boss a little faster, or much faster with a few more stacks of armor piercing rounds, does get a big threat off your back and lighten the load of, not dying faster, but that's the only enemy it affects. It only increases damage against boss enemies and otherwise does absolutely nothing else. Number 7, Bustling Fungus. After standing still for 1 second, create a zone that heals for 4.5% of your maximum health every second to all allies within 3 meters. Look, I know. How could Bungus be one of the worst items? It's iconic, it's the funny little mushroom, it's Bungus. Here's the thing, this item is iconic more so because of how central and amazing it is for Engineer. not because it's necessarily amazing for the whole cast. Yes, Bungus is great for Engineer. In fact, the healing from even just 1 or 2 fungi is actually pretty decent. Bungus suffers from much the same issue as Medkit, which is actually getting the healing from the item. However, where taking damage is pretty much inevitable and therefore Medkit will eventually do something for you, standing still, even if it's just for a second or two, is something you should essentially never do in Risk of Rain 2. 1 second might not sound terrible, but that's how long it takes for Bungus to start healing you. From 10% HP, 1 stack of Bungus will take forever to fully heal you. Standing still for that long will almost certainly lead to you getting hit if you aren't extremely careful with where you choose to stand, especially on later stages. Speaking of later stages, you know what enemies like to hang out on those stages? Brass Contraptions, Greater Wisps, and Elder Lemurians. Have fun standing still with those guys hanging out. Number 6, Rusted Key. A hidden cache containing an item, 80% green or 20% red, will appear in a random location on each stage. Opening the cache consumes this item. I'll say it now, the best use case for this item is corrupting it into additional encrusted keys. That is actually a pretty good use case, but that also has more to do with encrusted key and by extension some void items being busted rather than rusted key itself being good. For starters, the key does nothing until you get to the next stage. It won't help you in making it to the next stage at all, and it could have been a different white item that would have helped you survive the current stage, and future ones as well. The other problem is in assuming that the payoff for making it to the next stage with a rusted key is always worth it. When opening the lockbox, you will most likely get a green item. Some green items are very good, but there are also more than a few that range from situational to downright terrible. On the off chance that you do get a red item, those have the same issue. Some of them are amazing, but others are situational or just downright bad. In my opinion, an item that takes a full stage to turn into a different item that may or may not be useful isn't really worth going out of your way for in comparison to just having an item that will help you right away. Number 5, Personal Shield Generator. Gain a shield equal to 8% of your maximum health, recharges outside of danger. I have a sneaking suspicion that this placement will be controversial, but let me explain why I think this item isn't very good. Now, I'm sure most of you have probably heard the whole deal with this item ruining your one-shot protection, and while that is true, that isn't really my main problem with PSG. One-shot protection isn't nothing, but because it doesn't save you from multiple instances of damage at once, which happens all the time, think Elder Lemurians and Mithrix's Hammer, it isn't really much of a factor most of the time. My problem with PSG is kind of the same issue I have with Medkit. In order to start regenerating the shields, you must avoid taking damage for 7 seconds. I say start regenerating because it takes 2 seconds to regenerate all the shields, and if you take damage at any point during the regeneration, it stops regenerating immediately and restarts the timer. The other problem with PSG is that you need a few stacks or more to get a significant boost to your total health. It is nice that the shields scale with your level because they're based on your maximum HP and not a flat value like Bison stake is, but 8% still isn't a whole lot. With 400 health, a pretty reasonable amount of HP by mid-game, 1 PSG will give you 32 extra health as shields. 32 really isn't going to do much for you by mid-game, especially considering that it can't benefit from any of your other healing items. Just a real quick pause to say that if you're enjoying the video so far, you should totally hit the like and subscribe button. I mean, you don't have to, it's not like you owe me or anything. Number 4, War Banner. On level up, or starting the teleporter event, drop a banner that strengthens all allies within 16 meters. Raise attack and movement speed by 30%. This is yet again another item where the benefit is actually pretty solid, but making use of it is challenging. The 30% boost to movement speed is equivalent to a red whip, which is pretty good, but the fact that the buff only works inside the War Banner's radius and disappears 2 seconds after leaving it makes it hard to fully utilize the speed. So we're left with the attack speed boost, which ostensibly is good. It's essentially 2 soldier syringes for 1 white item. What sucks is that stacking War Banner doesn't increase the strength of the buff, only the radius of the War Banner. Now, that does make it easier to move around inside of the War Banner, but you'd need quite a few to fully cover a teleporter bubble. The other problem is that War Banner only drops upon leveling up or starting the teleporter. Early on, this is actually a good thing, as you level up pretty quickly during the first 2 stages. It gets exponentially worse as you progress though, to the point where you essentially only get it during the teleporter. That's still not terrible, but it limits the item's usefulness past early game. My main gripe with War Banner is that it incentivizes you to stay within a small area, which makes dodging harder and therefore makes it more likely for you to get hit and die. It's too tempting to want to stay inside that bubble for the 30% boost to attack and movement speed, only for you to get sniped by enemies for staying inside the little bubble. Number 3, Roll of Pennies. Gain 3 gold on taking damage from an enemy, scales over time. Unlike a lot of items on this list, using this one is pretty straightforward. That might be the problem though. Roll of Pennies basically functions like a bootleg Shrine of Blood, and in a lot of ways it can be better than a Shrine of Blood. Much like Medkit, the amount of damage is irrelevant, so you can purposely take small hits of damage, perhaps with repulsion armor plates or medkits, to get gold faster and therefore loot the stage faster. If you don't have any healing items or repulsion armor plates, then this gets harder to use. Purposefully taking damage is always a risky idea, and the later the run goes, the worse the idea becomes. Speaking of late game, this item is pretty bad for late game. Gold really isn't a major concern in later stages except for the legendary chest on stage 4, and looking at the enemies on those stages, yeah, I probably wouldn't chance that. There are just better ways of getting money that don't involve intentionally getting hit and potentially dying. Number 2, Monster Tooth. Killing an enemy spawns a healing orb that heals for 8 plus an additional 2% of maximum health. I think this is a pretty infamously disliked item, which is a shame considering it's a pretty cool and iconic item from the first game. I actually used to think this item was way worse than it actually is, and I thought it only healed for a flat 4 HP per orb. That said, even though it's not that bad, 8 HP plus 2% of your max health is still not good. For reference, if you had 300 HP and killed 10 enemies, and then you picked up all of the orbs, remember, you actually have to pick up the orbs unlike Risk of Rain 1, it would heal you for a grand total of 140 HP. 10 enemies for about half of your health back. Amazing. To be frank though, if it weren't for the fact that you actually had to pick up the orbs, this item would actually be pretty good, especially with a few stacks. However, because you do have to pick them up, unless you're playing a melee survivor where you have to get close to enemies to kill them, it kinda sucks. Before we name the number 1 worst item in Risk of Rain 2, which you probably already know what it is, I'd like to give an honorable, or dishonorable, mention to Power Elixir. Taking damage to below 25% health consumes this item, healing you for 75% of maximum health. This is an honorable mention only because this item technically isn't bad at all, it just pisses me off personally. I fully understand that nowhere in the item description does it say anything about healing you if your HP ever drops to 0, but it still feels like it should. I think this item just feels so unsatisfying to pick up because it does nothing to heal you unless you get below 25% HP, and the times where that does happen are not uncoincidentally the times where you just drop to 0 and die. It doesn't save you when it feels like it should, and it does nothing unless you get very hurt, but a specific amount of very hurt. With Power Elixir properly dissed, we can talk about number 1, Bison Steak. Increases maximum health by 25. I don't even want to talk about this item. Like, what do you want me to say about this item that hasn't already been said? It's hands down the worst item in the entire game, and if I could send a personal letter to Gearbox to remove it, I would. No other item ruins the game like this one does. It's so unbalanced and unfun that I can't believe the developers even thought about adding Bison Steak, let alone that they actually implemented it. If you pick this item up, or worse, find a Bison Steak 3D printer, you may as well just reset the run because you've already won and there's no point in playing the rest of the run out. In fact, as soon as you see this item, you may as well uninstall the game too, because this item is so common that it will just ruin all of your other runs too by making the game so trivially easy that a single-celled organism could beat it. Bison Steak can die and go to heck. I hate it. Well, that was the worst of the worst for the white items. I hope you enjoyed my rant about why Bison Steak is awful and should be removed from the game. If you'd like to argue why Bison Steak should still be in the game or would like to add something else, feel free to do so in the comments and I'll respond sooner or later. If you liked what you saw, hit the like and subscribe buttons. It's good for the algorithm, please, please. Anyway, that's all I've got for now. Until next time.